really in the mix, and a very accomplished person. So he's not an obscure figure by any stretch of the imagination. And his writing has incredible significance for environmental ethics. I mean, the book, The Holy Earth, is all about our moral obligations to the planet. It's about our moral obligations to an agrarian-styled environmentalism, and that starts to explain why we don't know as much about him in environmental ethics as we should. But it's incredibly significant for the discussions today that we're having about sustainable agriculture and about our obligations to nature more generally. Bailey was one of the first to use the word biocentrism in his writing. And we associate that with John Muir, but Bailey was out there in the front. He was a big fan of Muir's. And I think Bailey has an incredible contemporary relevance. I mean, I think he provides us, as we'll see, with a foundation for understanding this movement to relocalize agriculture, to adapt agriculture to natural conditions, to, in the words of Wes Jackson, right, mimic the prairie ecosystem of the Midwest. I think Bailey is all over the work of Wes Jackson. I think he's infused in the work of Wendell Berry and the neo-agrarians. So this is someone who has, I think, something to say to us, not just philosophically, but practically in how we order ourselves on the planet and how we understand the morality of land use today. Well, a question. If he's so darn important, so relevant, so significant, so original, right, why don't we know more about him? Well, it is because I think the field of environmental ethics, which is my home field, we've organized ourselves around a set of dogmas. This is slowly changing, but I think it's still true that there are a certain set of assumptions that really define the field of environmental ethics. And those dogmas, I think, exert a powerful grip on the field such that certain questions are asked, are deemed relevant, certain figures rise to the fore, like John Muir, the sage of Yosemite Valley, and other figures like Liberty Hyde Bailey, who almost looks like a Gothic figure here on the steps of the School of Agriculture at Cornell, recede, and we forget about them, and their work goes out of print. And that's also part of Bailey's problem. You can't find his writing, even though, again, The Holy Earth is, I think, deserves to be considered an environmental classic. So there are reasons why we know some figures, why they become heroes in the environmentalist story, and why other figures become comparatively more obscure. So what I want to talk about is the development of environmental ethics very quickly. I know some of you are well versed in environmental ethics. Some of you, this may be a little bit new to you, so I want to get us up to speed in talking about how this field developed, how it coalesced around these dogmas or these commitments, and then move to the discussion of what Bailey offers and how Bailey can help us rethink some of the commitments of environmental ethics and agriculture in practice. So if we're talking about environmental ethics as an academic pursuit, right, we're talking about a field, a branch of applied philosophy that's devoted to exploring questions of environmental value, right, including direct obligations to nature, right, and then what those values, those obligations demand of us, especially in terms of conservation work, environmental policy, environmental problem solving, and so on. Right. Now, environmental ethics, you can really trace it, you can think of it as being forced by a number of upwelling kind of institutional and intellectual changes in the 1960s and 1970s. And on the one hand, you can think that environmental ethics developed as a product of external forces, in other words, external to philosophy. And here we can look at the 60s and 70s. We can, the rise of the modern environmental movement with books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the rise of environmental mobilization, advocacy at the 1960s and 70s, unfortunate and national disasters like the Santa Barbara oil spill and the Cuyahoga River burning, which rivers aren't supposed to do, right? In the late 60s, we go a little bit later, we can look to Love Canal. Unfortunately, there's a litany of disasters here that really galvanize public opinion around environmental problems. And so part of that coalescence of environmental concern around environmental problems, well, part of that's explained, I think, by disasters and a growing intellectual movement. And also, I think that same kind of challenge, or that same kind of recognition that there was a real environmental problem, forced philosophers who should have something to say about why we have environmental problems as crises of values and so on, into a new role. And I think we also see that the professionalization of ecology, the institutionalization of ecology, the popularization, Barry Commoner and Paul Ehrlich's work in the 60s and 70s also plays a role in this rise of environmental concern. And there were internal shifts within academic philosophy during the same time that also explain why environmental ethics developed the way it did. This is the same period where you see across college campuses the turn toward applied topics. Social and political philosophy really enjoys an incredible period of growth here. We see very important work being done by philosophers like John Rawls and Robert Nozick. We see the launching of journals like Philosophy and Public Affairs, again promising a more practical or policy-oriented philosophy, applied philosophy, work by people like Peter Singer, who then become kind of emblematic of this new, very engaged approach to philosophy. And so environmental ethics is part of this movement, and part of this flourishing of applied ethics, engineering ethics, bioethics, right, legal ethics, business ethics, and so on. Okay, so this brings us to the dogmas. And I realize that's not a dog. Probably should have worked the pun a little harder there. But it looks pretty dogmatic. That's a dogmatic lynx, I think. So that was my intent. The three dogmas are non-anthropocentrism, or more negatively phrased, anti-anthropocentrism. The second one is what you call sort of a dualistic reading of environmental values, or intellectual dualism. And the third is an anti-agrarian and pro-wilderness bias. And I think all of these dogmas, I think it's inarguable that they exerted a profound influence on the development of the field. I think all of them are slowly changing. And I think part of this is a kind of a maturation of environmental ethics as new approaches come online and as new critiques really take hold. Bill Cronin's critique of the wilderness idea, I think, is a classic example of this. Some of them are starting to recede, but I think they still really exert a powerful grip on the field. And for many people, they define what environmental ethics is all about. So dogma number one, anti-anthropocentrism, or more positively, non-anthropocentrism. Well, this really was the reason to have an environmental ethics in many respects, right? That environmental ethics would break with the Western philosophical tradition, which was humanistic, focused on human interests only, right? And would really advance a kind of radically new non-anthropocentric ethic that would morally enfranchise individual organisms, living organisms, populations, species, ecosystemic wholes, right? That this would be a kind of a radical break with the individualism often of the Western ethical tradition, and with the anthropocentrism, the human-centeredness of the tradition. And for many environmental ethicists, this is the defining feature of the field. If you're not a non-anthropocentrist, in other words, if you're a humanist, you cannot be an environmental ethicist for some, right? In its most kind of forceful expression. Right? And so this becomes kind of a doctrinaire approach to the field that I think really exerts a strong influence, especially in the early years of the field's development. You can kind of understand why this would be, because after all, if you're just talking about environmental values as a slight extension of traditional human ethical systems, then why do we have to have anything separate called environmental ethics, right? I mean, it's already covered by Kant and Mill and Aristotle and Dewey and others, right? If we do need a new non-anthropocentric ethic, then, well, we need a new field to make sense of that, right? And that will be a radical break with the tradition. A good example of all this is what many consider to be one of the first papers in environmental ethics proper. And that's a paper by Richard Routley, later Richard Sylvan, called Do We Need a New and Environmental Ethic? And this paper is really well known for a controversial thought experiment called the last man or last person example, but it's an interesting little vignette, really. I mean, it's kind of a litmus test to out you as an anthropocentrist or a non-anthropocentrist. And Routley came up with this little scenario that the last person on earth would go about destroying everything that lives on the earth, right? Just wantonly for their own enjoyment, let's say. Now, it's the last person on earth, so whatever they're doing is not going to harm anyone present, right? Or in the future. Future generations are off the table. There aren't going to be any more future people, right? And so then Routley asked, is this wrong? Well, if you think it's wrong, then you're admitting that somehow there's value in the world that's being destroyed that's independent of any individual kind of valuation of that value, right? The value exists as an objective part of the natural world, right? And you're a non-anthropocentrist. If you think, well, if the last person on earth wants to destroy the natural world and that makes them happy, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Because there's no harm to be worried about, because nature can't be harmed because it doesn't care, it doesn't have a moral status. Right? So this was a very powerful, I think, a very interesting, salient example of this way of thinking in environmental ethics. And I think as you look at the development of the field in the 80s and 90s, you see this approach, this non-anthropocentric approach, really gain a full head of steam. I mean, books are published during this period, monographs that develop various aspects of non-anthropocentrism. They're all different. I mean, you have Paul Taylor being more individualistic in a biocentric way. You have Callicott and Ralston being more holistic. But they're of similar minds when it comes to what counts, and that's nature. Nature has intrinsic value or something like it. Right? And so humans aren't the only bearers of value in the universe. Right? And philosophers differed over where that value came from and whether it was objective or not or so on. But they are all of one mind that this was, basically the centerpiece of an environmental ethic. Any good environmental ethic had to recognize the intrinsic value of nature, not just its instrumental or its use value. The problem. Well, there are a number of problems with this. I mean, sociologically, we could say one problem is that when you actually go out and poll people, right, and ask them what their their environmental ethical attitudes are, they don't come back with non-anthropocentrism, or rather, they don't come back with just non-anthropocentrism. Right? And so this is just a summary table of some work that I've done with a sociologist at the University of Vermont, Bob Manning. And we've done a series of studies looking at the public opinion, public environmental ethics opinion of residents in New England. And this particular chart here is from a study we did in Vermont, a representative sample, 612 Vermont residents. And there's a lot of nomenclature here. That's really not that important, but one of the take-home messages here is that this is a mean agreement score. So the bars that are leading upward here to 2, 3, 4, and 5, 5 represents strong agreement, okay? And so one of the patterns we see is that multiple environmental ethics, right, draw strong agreement from this sample, right, the representative sample of the Vermont public. And the environmental ethics themselves are all over the board philosophically. Yeah, we have some non-anthropocentrism, right, what we'd label organicism, animism, natural rights, that sort of thing. But we also have lots of very broadly sort of humanistic ethics, concern for future generations, quality of life, even good old utilitarian notions of efficiency and so on that really resonate with the public, right? And so to me, and to, I guess, fellow travelers, we look at this and we think, it's not the case that non-anthropocentrism, sort of a pure commitment to non-anthropocentrism is always the way to go in environmental ethics. And in fact, if you were to follow that route, you might actually undercut potential policy coalitions, people who value nature, value it in different ways, but perhaps could find common ground in particular situations. Right? If you start out thinking that the only correct environmental ethic is a non-anthropocentric ethic, right, then potentially you're saying all these people are just wrong. Now, philosophy has a long tradition of doing that kind of thing, right? Who cares what the public thinks? It's not right, right? That's not what we do. But I think we should care. I mean, I think we should care what the public thinks because these are the voters, these are the consumers, these are the people that support nonprofits, these are the people who go to work every day. These are us. And so that's very significant when it comes to environmental ethics. Environmental ethicists should be concerned about this. So I think ethical pluralism, rather than a single sort of singular monistic, as it would be called, right, environmental ethic, is very compelling. And I think a lot of environmental ethicists are uncomfortable with that because the idea is that we're after some sort of, monolithic, non-anthropocentric environmental ethic. Okay, dogma number 2. Dualistic thinking. Well, we're all guilty of this. I'm guilty of this. When I teach environmental ethics, I throw these things up on the PowerPoint, and I teach environmental ethics often through these concepts, right? Because they're so memorable, right? We like these little antipodes. We like pairs. We like neat, cleavages between ideas that we think are, very profound at sort of war with one another. So they're useful analytically sometimes, they're useful as teaching tools, but they do great mischief when you think that these categories really map onto real things in our history or in our way of valuing. Right? And so environmental ethics has really been in the grip, I think, of many forms of philosophical or conceptual dualism. And one of the great debates we have is between anthropocentrism and non-anthropocentrism. Right? That's driven a lot of the development of the field. Historically and philosophically, right, we like to divide conservationists from preservationists. Right? If you're a conservationist, you're kind of with Gifford Pinchot and wise use of natural resources, efficiency, or you're a utilitarian, which is a bad word. And if you're a preservationist, right, you're with John Muir, the side of angels, right? You believe in beauty and intrinsic value and all that kind of stuff, and you defend the wild, right? Intrinsic value, instrumental value, another way of saying it, just in terms of axiology or of value, right? And it's not to say that these categories don't really, that they don't tap into a real tension between ways of valuing or ordering our concepts, but what's happened is they become reality. We tend to think that you have to be one or the other, right? And we also often put them in hierarchies. We think one is preferred over the other. And I think the dualistic thinking of environmental ethics, I think it's mirrored in environmental history, as we'll see, and I think it's really led us down a path that we shouldn't have gone down. I think it really flies in the face to the kind of valuing that I showed in the last slide. And I think the historical record is full of figures like Bailey, who didn't carve up the world this way, right? I mean, Bailey was someone who would, in one paragraph, extol biocentric values, and then he would talk about conquering the earth through agriculture. You're like, what? Are you schizophrenic? What's wrong with you? You can't say those things. Well, his generation, he felt both. I mean, he felt a duty to till the earth in a moral fashion, right, and to produce a bounty for society. And he believed in the working landscape, but he also loved nature, and he thought that love of the creation, as he would put it, was incredibly strong and an animating force in his life. And environmental ethics wants to disentangle all that. That's too messy, right? We want to have pure categories. We want to have absolutes, and I think that's a problem. And historians are the first generation, as we'll see, of environmental historians are no better. I don't want to say that. That sounds negative. Have fallen into some of the same kinds of traps. The third and last dogma is anti-agrarianism. I think you can make a very good case that this has been one of the defining features of environmental ethics. Next week, you'll have Paul Thompson here, an environmental philosopher who's done more than anyone else to bring agricultural issues into the environmental ethics discussion. And Paul has been a voice crying in the wilderness or crying on the farm for over a decade now. Things are slowly changing, but there aren't that many people who are exploring sort of agrarian or agricultural themes within environmental ethics. Why? Well, again, the field has formed around a very strong, I think, pro-wilderness bias. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I love the wilderness. And, the wilderness needs defenders, right? It needs philosophers, believe it or not, defending it sometimes. But the problem is that I think you could make the case that the pendulum has swung pretty far in that direction, and that we've really neglected working landscapes, especially agrarian landscapes, working forests and some cultural landscapes in our moral geographies. Those are the lands that have been seen as too anthropocentric, right? Too humanized, too deformed by human will and human value, and so they aren't as interesting as the wild. Right? That's starting to change, and actually historians are forcing that a little, Bill Cronin and others, but it's also starting to change in environmental ethics. But historically, this has been a very dominant thread in the environmental ethics story. You can see it in the dominance of non-anthropocentrism, right? Nature-centeredness. You can see why that way of thinking would perhaps be hostile to agrarian thinking. It need not be, I think, as Bailey shows us. The conservation targets that environmental ethicists have focused on. What's been wilderness, wildlife, endangered species, not so much farmland, right? Not so much sustainable agriculture, not regional planning, not new urbanism or any of these kinds of other movements that reflect a more humanized landscape. And I also think, again, the history is partly to blame here. I mean, I think the narratives we've told about where we come from really have shaped the landscapes that we think count, that we think are interesting, that we spend a lot of time talking about and valuing. And I think we can look to what I would call the perfect storm here of the dogmas, and that's this famous paper by Lynn White Jr. in Science Magazine in the late 60s. Now this is a very controversial paper. It's one of the papers that launched hundreds of dissertations and probably is responsible as much as any other document for the rise of environmental ethics, for eco-theology, and other approaches that try to look at the sort of spiritual roots and deep cultural roots of environmental questions. Well, White was a medieval historian, and he wrote this paper in the late 60s, published it in Science Magazine. Became very controversial because he said that the Judeo-Christian tradition was to blame, right, for our environmental problems, right? That you could say this would happen after, but oil spills, right, toxic waste dumps, overpopulation, species lost, loss of wildlands, etc., right? All of those environmental problems, yes, were driven by the application of science and technology and so on and development, right? But lying behind that was this anthropocentric worldview that we all inherited from the dominant religious tradition of the West. And that was especially the creation story in Genesis that put us in, right, sort of control, right, in dominion, having dominion over everything that flies, creepeth, and crawleth, right, on the earth. We name all the creatures, go forth, multiply. It's been a little while since Sunday school, but you all recall this, right? So this was the language that kind of gave us a divine entitlement to master the earth. And White said, even if you aren't a practicing Jew or a practicing Christian, right, this stuff is so steeped in our culture that it's forcing your hand even if you don't think it is. Right? And so this became very controversial. He said Christianity was the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. Right? That was a criticism. And he said we really need to return to fundamentals here, metaphysics, cosmology, ethics, to derive some sort of new environmental ethic that would be much more harmonious. And Baird Callicott, one of the pioneering environmental philosophers of the last 30 years, said when Lynn White wrote this, the agenda for the field was set. These were marching orders for environmental ethics. Right, so this article becomes very important in the story. And White actually laces his discussion with a few examples, and they're very revealing. One is especially disparaging of agriculture. And he's a medieval historian, and he's talking about the advent of the heavy plow in the 7th century European peasant society, right? And before the heavy plow, everything was great, right? We lived in harmony with nature, with the scratch plow, because we really couldn't do anything that bad to nature. But once we had the heavy plow that really dug into the soil, right, it was alienating, right? It drove a wedge between humans and nature. We became dominators. Man's relation to the soil was changed. Before we'd been part of nature, now we were exploiters. And this is like bold technological determinism, right? But it's driven by this anthropocentric worldview that White thinks is behind the whole problem, right? And agriculture represents the fall, right? It's the thing that we have done to the planet that has screwed it up, that's driven a wedge between us and the natural order, right? And we've used technology to make it even worse. But it's our ideas that lie behind the application of technology in this case that are faulty. And so we need to have a non-anthropocentric worldview replace that faulty anthropocentrism. Well, it wouldn't be that bad if environmental ethics was just kind of analytically trying to figure out what a kind of logical, rational, persuasive, justifiable, non-anthropocentric worldview was all about. It's more complicated than that because environmental ethicists have turned to environmental historians, partly, I think, for warrant or for justification for these ideas and for the dogmas. And in fact, environmental ethicists have found very useful information in the first generation of environmental history that basically provides evidence for the kinds of views that we're talking about here. A common story emerged in environmental ethics very early on. A common intellectual history emerged. And it really traced the rise of non-anthropocentric environmental ethics through the conservation impulse, right to the roots of turn-of-the-century conservationism, Gifford Pinchot, John Muir, and their allies, and a common, what I call a potted history of environmental ethics emerged, where on the one hand you had the early transcendentalists and romantics like Thoreau waxing poetically and aesthetically about the value of nature, influencing heavily people like John Muir, who becomes a wilderness sage and a leading kind of proto-biocentrist of his time, allied against the forces of doom here, the utilitarian strand or the conservationist strand, if that's the preservationist strand, get back to our dualism. George Perkins Marsh, Man and Nature, the mid-19th century, informing the utilitarian thought of Gifford Pinchot, first head of the Forest Service. And then as history would have it, these two duke it out over Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite. They were friends, allies in conservation. Then they parted under the, very dramatic circumstances over the damming of this valley in the west, with Muir being, again, the preservationist biocentric mantle being laid on Muir, Pinchot wearing the black hat in the environmentalist story, the bad guy. And it fits into this really neat, almost teleological narrative where we see the development of non-anthropocentrism in its early stages. It becomes challenged by an alternative moral story, right? They face off dramatically in Yosemite Valley. Pinchot wins, the good politician that he is. They both fight over the soul of Teddy Roosevelt along the way, right? And Muir dies of a broken heart. I mean, it's a beautiful story, and it really feeds into this sense of narrative. And then, of course, we have Aldo Leopold, right, coming along as the savior of environmental ethics. I mean, Leopold comes along and, as some would say, single-handedly delivers environmental ethics into the modern era, really picking up on Muir's biocentrism with a little dose of Pinchot's practicality and giving us the land ethic, giving us a Sand County Almanac by mid-century. And the dominant reading of Leopold's work in environmental ethics, and I think environmental history, is that Leopold was a non-anthropocentrist. There are a few who have challenged this, but that's kind of the received story. That's certainly Baird Callicott's story. So with Leopold, we have someone who neatly, again, demonstrates this tension, this dualism. Right? The book on Leopold is he starts like Pinchot. He's a forester. Right? He starts in the Southwest as a utilitarian-minded forester. As an older man writing Sand County Almanac on his farmland in Wisconsin, he's a full-blown biocentrist talking about the rights of nature or its equivalent. I mean, that's the way the narrative has developed. He's certainly one of the first to say that our relationship to the natural world is an ethical question. Right? It's not just economic. Bailey actually said it before Leopold, strangely enough. But again, why don't we know that? Leopold is a giant, obviously, in environmental ethics. You can't start any discussion or end any discussion, I think, in environmental ethics without the obligatory nod to Leopold. And he's a master stylist. His writings will be read for generations. He deserves his place as in the canon as it's probably its biggest figure, its biggest thinker historically. You look at an essay like Thinking Like a Mountain, right? The fierce green fire. Leopold, as a young man, is out there shooting wolves in my neck of the woods in the Southwest because wolves were varmints, right? And one day he sees the fierce green fire die in the wolf's eyes, and he has a transformation, right? And he sort of concludes that he was thinking in a very juvenile way, ethically and scientifically, and he should be adopting the mountain view, right? The broader view of the place of humans on the planet. Right? And many environmental ethicists look at this and say, well, that's when Leopold had that non-anthropocentric conversion. Right? That's when he saw the green fire die, and the vestiges of utilitarianism in Pinchot and his forestry training left. Right? And in came Muir in the transcendental and the non-anthropocentric worldview that then Leopold would really set down in the land ethic. Right, where he gives us the moral dictum here. A thing is right when it tends to preserve integrity, stability, and beauty. The biotic community, it's wrong when it tends otherwise. Right? Telling a story about the development of ethics so that ethics begins in the human community and then it slowly extends out as we dissolve the boundaries between human and natural. The natural world becomes part of our moral community. and then it has something like intrinsic value, right? I mean, this is the dominant interpretation of Leopold. So the story really goes through a kind of, a very sharp and observable path, right? I mean, it starts with these kind of warring tribes, conservation and preservation, where you see glimmers of non-anthropocentrism in Muir. There's dust up between Pinchot and Muir, and out of that comes the victorious Pinchot. Then Leopold comes out of the Forest Service, his heart with Muir, you could say, and with a dose of managerial experience and community ecology under his belt, becomes a full-blown land ethicist, advancing the non-anthropocentric line of thought, right, for a generation of environmental ethicists who would come along in the late 60s and 70s and rediscover Leopold's work and read him as a non-anthropocentrist. As almost as if it had to happen that way, right? When you read this, it's almost as if, Muir had to happen so he could fight with Pinchot, and then we had to lose, right? And then Leopold had to come along and have a transformation, and then give us this document that then we discover again, and we invest it with all sorts of philosophical argument and fanciful language, but it's not anthropocentrism, and that's the mature expression of environmental ethic. Right? I mean, it's almost as, again, as if this sort of had to happen this way. And it rests upon the story of the conservation movement, the split between conservation and preservation. Leopold single-handedly saves us, and then Leopold gives us the foundation stone of environmental ethics. Well, what's wrong with this story? Well, I think there are a number of things wrong with this. First of all, it's simplified. Leopold was a more nuanced thinker than that, but Gifford Pinchot was a more nuanced thinker than that. This is not a one-note utilitarian. I mean, if we didn't have Gifford Pinchot, we wouldn't have a lot of forest land in this country. If we didn't have Teddy Roosevelt, especially, we wouldn't have a lot of national forest land in this country. Muir was also not a doctrinaire biocentrist, right? So, I mean, the distance between the two of those guys is much less than I think the story would lead one to think. And it simplifies the times in which they wrote and their real grappling with some pressing issues of the age. These were not ideologues. These were not drones for an environmental philosophy. Right? They were complex thinkers with all sorts of experiences behind them, and they thought very hard and long about the problems that they faced. It's also a distorted intellectual history. It's distorted because it distorts, again, the legacy of these people, and it distorts, I think, the conservation side of the story, the humanist side. Right? It almost only exists as a foil for non-anthropocentrism. And in fact, it was a very rich tradition, and folks like Bailey, as we'll see, I think, really give us an example of how the classic conservation tradition was much more interesting than just wise and efficient use of natural resources. Yeah, that was a big part of it, right? But there was also an aesthetics, a politics, and ethics of conservation that was very rich and I think very much ahead of its time during this period. And I think Bailey's work is a good example. And I think it's a very self-serving intellectual history, right? I mean, it's a story that just, it falls into the lap of the non-anthropocentrists. And again, I don't want to be too contentious here, but it's a very convenient story to tell, right? To claim Leopold as a non-anthropocentrist and that it was sort of a logical unfolding of this grand idea of non-anthropocentrism that had in its infancy Thoreau at Walden, in its juvenile stage John Muir, and then adulthood Aldo Leopold. It's just a little too neat. It makes me edgy. I don't like it. And I don't like it because I see the power of it. And it's not just the case that environmental philosophers were just cherry-picking the history, right? Okay, we'll read a little bit of this, we'll read a little bit of that, and we'll create a chain of events that rationalizes what we're doing. And in fact, if you look at the first generation of environmental histories, from Sam Hayes's Conservation and the Gospel of Efficiency to, of course, one of the great books in the tradition, Wilderness and the American Mind, right? This is the way environmental historians were painting the story, the exact same way. The same dogmas, right, filtered environmental history for environmental historians. You have the dominance of the wilderness wildlife storyline, often a very sharp anti-agrarian bias. You pick up the latest edition of this book. I was heavily influenced by Wilderness and the American Mind. It's a great book, deserves its reputation. But Nash has written a new epilogue, and if you read it, he kind of lays it all out on the table. He's worried about an agrarian planet. He's worried about a garden planet where everything's managed. I think that's probably a good worry, right? But he's really concerned, right? He's concerned that there won't be a place for the wilderness, right? Strong attraction to dualistic thinking, conservation, preservation. Don Worster, imperial ecology versus Arcadian ecology. Stephen Fox, amateurs versus professionals, right? I mean, it's a powerful, powerful framework, right, to pigeonhole thinkers in. And it's, again, I think that explains why we don't have Bailey. Bailey expressed commitments on both sides of the fence, and there's really, I mean, it's difficult to put him in one of these slots. And I think that's, again, why some traditions have risen to the fore, others have not. And a kind of triumphalism about biocentrism. Again, this kind of Whiggish intellectual history, right? That, you know, we'll tell the story in a certain way so that the Muir strand comes out smelling like a rose, and the Pinchot strand is the, you know, the unwanted and the, you know, the corrupt side of the family tree that we don't want to talk about. It's embarrassing, right? I think that really does violence to the historical record. And so the upshot is that, you know, the historical roots of environmental ethics here, you know, are planted in this ideological version of non-anthropocentrism. It is a kind of Whiggish intellectual history. The field's generally dismissive of agriculture and working landscapes and the values they reflect. I think at the same time, the humanism of the tradition has really been seriously underplayed and almost caricatured in these accounts. It's presented often in a very unflattering way. And as a result, and I think this is the real unfortunate thing, is that the field of environmental ethics often has very little to say about land use, about agriculture, right, about urban planning, about green buildings, about the things that probably matter more than ever today, than they ever have. And environmental ethicists are not set up right, historically, philosophically, often to tackle many of these problems. And so what I want to argue is a repotting of this potted history, a replanting of environmental ethics in different soil. And I think we should return to the intellectual history, look at it anew, without these dogmas blinding us to certain voices, landscapes, ideas, and to see what we can find of use. I mean, the search for a usable past here, I think, is very much needed. I think it's very justified. And I think one strand that we could really explore is what I call the civic agrarian strand, or the agrarian environmental strand. I think Bailey is at the headwaters of this tradition in environmental thought, and I think it's time that he had his due. This is Bailey standing next to his publications, which is pretty daunting. Now I could do that, but it would have to be copies of lots of copies of the, you know, of one book. I mean, this is someone who just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. He was a madman in that way. He's a forgotten polymath. I mean, he's someone who had a hand in everything, and perhaps as a result, right? He's known by, you know, he's known by horticultural scientists for a certain thing. He's not really known by environmentalists, but he's known by rural reformers. He's known by deans of agriculture, professors who are named Liberty Hyde Bailey professors. He's known in certain communities, but because of his intellectual omnivory, I guess, right, and because of his output, right, he's really crossed so many communities that it's difficult really to get a sense of Bailey's true legacy. I mean, he was the premier horticultural scientist of his age. He was a rural reformer. He was, you know, an active conservationist. Wrote a lot about education. Wrote a lot of things that really echoed John Dewey's writings on progressive education during, you know, the 19-teens and 1920s. He was a dean of agriculture at Cornell, an ambassador of agriculture nationally and internationally. And I think he deserves to be seen as an environmental philosopher as a result of all of this and other things. Well, his environmental philosophy is really neat. I mean, it's really packed with lots of interesting ideas. And why I think it is so neat and so interesting is that he combines sensibilities, ideas, and arguments that, again, in environmental ethics, we really keep at arm's length, that we like to separate and we like to cordon off from one another. So on the one hand, if we look at some of his more classic conservation writings, we can find fairly typical early conservation ideas about soil fertility and soil health and so on. But we also, I think, find some interesting normative stuff about why we need to adapt our agriculture to the land. And I think this is a very prescient idea that we're still grappling with today. You know, Bailey said, a good part of agriculture is to learn how to adapt one's work to nature. Right? To live in right relation to the natural conditions is one of the first lessons that a wise farmer or any other wise man or person, right, learns. And so soil fertility was part of that, but it wasn't a narrow technical understanding. I mean, this is someone who was, really enamored of the beauty of the landscape and thought the farm landscape had a great aesthetic value that we ought to maintain. Right? Soil fertility was also an aesthetic act. It wasn't just a technical act to produce more crops over and over again. It was also the beauty of the farm landscape was in the fertility of its soil. Right? So there's some interesting sort of proto-stewardship notions going on here that I think are being rediscovered today, although Bailey's work is not necessarily, but the stewardship line in the environmental tradition has gotten a lot of attention of late. Duty to future generations. If you read some of Bailey's work, he sounds almost deontological, and he's really talking about a philosophical duty to the future. The man who plunders the soil is a robber because he takes that which is not his own, and he withholds bread from the mouths of generations yet to be born. Right? There are many generations of folk yet to come after us who will have equal right with us to the products of the globe. We don't clean up our work or leave the earth in order. The remnants and accumulation of mining camps are left to ruin and decay. Vast areas of forest lands are left in brush and waste, unthoughtful of the future. So this was very much on his mind. Right? I mean, in environmental ethics, we call this weak anthropocentrism. It's still humanistic. We're talking about future people here, right? But it's a more enlightened, broader, sort of temporally expanded understanding of humanism, right? And Bailey was really concerned that the mining, farming, forestry, wildlife management practices, such as they were of his time, were destructive and were actually harmful of future generations. Right? I think that also makes him very much a contemporary figure because we're still trying to fashion an intergenerational ethic and what it means, what it might require of us. And so Bailey was thinking these things quite a while ago. And here's the biggie, the 800-pound gorilla, right? Biocentrism. Well, lo and behold, the agrarian philosopher here, the celebrator of elements of utilitarian conservation and of tilling the earth, was also a biocentrist. Every animal and plant, he wrote in the Outlook to Nature in 1905, lives for itself and apparently as completely as if man had never existed. We still want to ask what things are for. Right? I mean, you read some of Ed Wilson's work today. He says the same thing. Right? We always want to know what it's for. It's for itself. Right? In The Holy Earth, which probably stands as Bailey's masterpiece, his book that is most relevant to environmental philosophy, the one book that actually has gotten some press in the environmental studies literature. Believe it or not, Rod Nash in Wilderness and the American Mind actually mentions this because it had a profound impact on Aldo Leopold's thinking. In The Holy Earth, Bailey writes, the living creation is not exclusively man-centered. It's biocentric. We have genetic relations with all living things, and our aristocracy is the aristocracy of nature. We can claim no gross superiority, no isolated self-importance. The creation and not man is the norm. Now, I think this is an incredible statement in 1915. It's an incredible statement today, still. It's incredible that a dean of agriculture in an Ivy League school would say this, that a presidential appointee would say this, right? That a scientist and a kind of cold-eyed horticultural scientist in the early years of the 20th century would say this. This is all quite remarkable. And I think it really, it's unfortunate that Bailey, Muir has been lifted up and then Leopold, but Bailey, in many respects, was out front in the biocentric discussion back in the day. And again, he's been lost to the tradition. And maybe it's because this isn't just Bailey's environmental philosophy, biocentrism. Right? There are other elements here that also sit alongside his biocentrism. And philosophically, we don't like to put those things together. Historically, we don't like to put those things together. And so I think, again, the dogmas are to explain why Bailey's biocentrism hasn't gotten much play. Agrarianism and civic virtue is the final element here. A lot of Bailey's writing tied pretty classical notions of agrarian virtue, right? The moral quality of tilling the earth, the good farmer, right? The moral character that would be developed through work in the land, with a real understanding of civic responsibility, that somehow the farmer was doing a special kind of civic work for the society because the farmer attached us all to the land. The farmer was intimate with the soil. The farmer was the foundation upon which we rested in a material sense, and also had a great responsibility to the community of the future, right? And so Bailey's work really invested his biocentrism, right? His understanding of stewardship, his understanding of the adaptation of agriculture in the natural world with a strong sense of civic obligation and civic identity that would be enhanced, bolstered by, right, a kind of new agrarian order that he thought really should take hold. He was very concerned about the loss of farming populations in the countryside moving to the cities. Just as we're concerned about local agriculture today, Bailey was very concerned about it, and he thought that a love of nature was part of what needed to be cultivated in addition to a crop. Right? We needed to cultivate this sort of nature sense, this outlook toward nature that would keep our purchase on the land. Merely to make it productive, the land, and keep it clean and bear a reverent regard for its products is a special prerogative of good agriculture and good citizenry. Right? Sort of an indirect ethic here, where you don't act rightly toward one another unless you act rightly toward the earth. And you can actually see some of this if you look at Kant's work of animals. It's interesting, a kind of indirect way of thinking about environmental ethics. Our present greatest need is the development of the community sense, and Bailey thought civic societies, organizations, organizing farmers, organizing conservationists, country reformers, this was the way to go to build community. And he was concerned that there was a natural kind of libertarian tendency on the farm that would turn farmers away from the community, and he really wanted to fight that. And one of the ways that he really, I think, demonstrated the value of this vision was his celebration of school gardens, which seems sort of humble today, right? Actually, they're enjoying a renaissance, I think. Bailey wrote a lot about school gardening and about nature study. And he was really convinced that these were just incredibly important activities in the community. Right? They taught children to put them in fundamental sympathy with natural things, expanded moral instincts, trains in accuracy and observation, stimulates the love of nature, evolves civic pride. He thought this would link the school to the community, shades again of this kind of Deweyan understanding of the role of the school in the society, which I think is very interesting. Gave food to people who couldn't afford it otherwise. Right? This was a kind of a multi-dimensional, a humble garden could do many things in Bailey's view. And I think today we see the resurgence of school gardens, community gardens, again as this kind of civic instrument that fulfills environmental, ethical ends, but also social and political ends as well. Pride of place and so on. So what I think here we have is a kind of holistic vision for environmental ethics that is really rooted in a kind of civic and agrarian understanding of the natural world, where nature appreciation is a civic action. The love of nature will motivate citizens, Bailey thought, to protect the countryside, right? To be mindful of future generations and to reinvigorate the community. And this was a real integrative landscape philosophy. And Bailey loved the wilderness. He wrote about forests and wildlife and so on. He didn't think we had to choose, but he was ultimately a defender of the farm, the field, the garden. And he was an agrarian and partly, I guess, a pastoralist as well. And he offered a philosophy of those landscapes, right? Really propping them up on a very, I think, respectable intellectual foundation. And I think if we look at someone today like Michael Pollan, right? I think there's shades of some of Bailey's work in what Pollan is doing today and his arguments in horticulture and gardening and so on, and botany. It was a pluralistic environmental ethic, to be sure. We have future generations, biocentrism, civic identity and obligation, stewardship, adaptation. Right? And we could go on with several others as well. Those are some of the dominant strands in the tradition. Bailey did not seek to reduce those different ethical ideas to one universal principle that was the appropriate environmental ethic. He was comfortable with that pluralism, with that messiness, that a lot of environmental philosophers want to obliterate, want to channel it to one environmental ethic. Now, this isn't necessarily an unalloyed good. I mean, there are some problems here philosophically. I mean, one question I'm looking at is could Bailey have it both ways? Could he be this sort of happy-footed pluralist extolling all the values of nature, including biocentric values? Basically, in Bailey's view, God created a holy earth, and could he, at the same time, express more culturally bound understandings of environmental value, future generations, the aesthetics of the farm, and so on? How do those sit alongside one another? Can he have it both ways? Can you have a kind of objective understanding of ethics in the furniture of the world, so to speak, and also a kind of a projectivist or subjectivist approach, culturally bound approach to ethics? There's a lot of philosophical discussion to be had about that. I think it's interesting that Bailey expressed all those views. It doesn't mean he made it easy on us, however, and so I think that there's work to be done there. In what I've claimed for Bailey in the book that Dane mentioned at the beginning, A Landscape of Reform, is that he's really a very important figure in what I call the third way of American environmentalism. And this is to play off the dualism thing here. It's with apologies to Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, the third way politics. There's similarity, but I won't claim that. And the idea here is that Bailey, also Lewis Mumford, I think Benton Mackay and Leopold, mentioned all these figures before. Really, I think their work presents kind of an alternative between the nature first and human first approaches to environmentalism that have captured our attention and scholarship and imagination. It's this kind of a middle path, and it's been overgrown because of these intellectual histories we've told and because of the way environmental ethics has developed, and we haven't seen this path. Right? It's a pluralistic, civic-minded, geographically pluralistic, ethically pluralistic approach to environmentalism. It's pragmatic in spirit, sometimes in letter, and I think it was the dominant approach to conservation in what we today would call environmentalism in the interwar period. I just think that for some reason, these dogmas, the ideology of the 60s and 70s, we've looked back at that tradition with very distorted lenses, and we've bended it to fit our ideological purposes. And I think that's been a real shame, because I think we've lost voices like Bailey's who really have something to say to us, and these third way thinkers, again, that I think are worth recovering. So to conclude here, I just want to talk about a couple threads that kind of the so what. So this is historical and a little bit philosophical, but what's going on the land today? I mean, so I said Bailey was relevant. Okay, he's relevant for environmental ethics and environmental history, but how is his legacy, his influence patent on the landscape today? Well, I think one place we can see it quite clearly is in the work of Wes Jackson at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. Jackson is part of the neo-agrarian writers who have risen to the fore in the last 30 years or so. Wendell Berry is probably the most well-known of this crowd. Jackson's a scientist, a geneticist who founded the Land Institute in the mid-70s, and he actually cites Bailey's work as one of the key inspirational pieces of work in the Land Institute, as well as Aldo Leopold. Especially the idea of adapting agriculture to nature. I mean, that really is the philosophy behind the perennial polyculture of the Land Institute. And so, also like Bailey, I think we see Jackson's work melds a kind of biocentric philosophy with a more pragmatic or humanist understanding of agrarian values and human health and civic obligation. Right? And so he really is an heir to the Baileyan tradition, and I think that it's interesting to see someone of his stature, again, outside the narrow environmentalist tradition, being the one who's one of the few who's trying to put Bailey back on the map through his work. And natural systems agriculture is what Jackson is doing and his colleagues are doing at the Land Institute. And there's a lot of detail here, but the idea is that you want to basically mimic the prairie. You want to create a domestic prairie where you're using solar-driven, you're using the sun, right, to plant perennial plant species, especially sunflowers or composites, legumes and grasses. The deep roots of the plants, hold the soil in place, build fertility, fix nitrogen. And it's a real experiment to see if this kind of agriculture, alternative form of agriculture, natural systems agriculture, can yield like the industrial model, right? And whether it's sustainable and replicable on a broad scale. And there's some very promising early results, but again, this is very different than the way we're used to thinking about agriculture, and so this is kind of a radical departure. But it's interesting work, and I think it really does drive home, well, it does display a lot of kind of updated Bayleyan themes, and I think you see that especially when Jackson steps back from his work and he writes about what he's doing, right? And he often wraps the agrarianism and the sustainability talk in a real civic vision that does, again, strike to Bailey's interest in linking these things to the community. In his book, Altars of Unhewn Stone, he says, we need to establish a new economic order. It's going to require full citizenship, the founding fathers required of us, expected of us, which includes the obligations to speak and participate in communities. Right, so to build a sustainable society, it's going to require nothing less than speaking our minds in wholesome, creative, and responsible ways, moving power from Washington and Topeka back closer to the land and to the community. Right, and so this, again, the relocalization of agriculture, the civic mindedness of neo-agrarianism in Jackson's hands, tied to a kind of an environmental ethic of sustainability. I think you could see this in many places. I think it's been nicely encapsulated by Tom Lyson, recently deceased, unfortunately, a rural sociologist at Cornell, Liberty Hyde Bailey professor of sociology at Cornell, coined in his book Civic Agrarianism. And what Lyson is talking about is the institutional expression of this relocalization of agriculture. Right? And the form it takes are the forms that are around us. It's the farmer's market, right, in Missoula. It's a community garden in Taylor. It's community-supported agriculture. It's restaurant agriculture. It's Alice Waters, right? It's all of these things. It's school gardens. It's rooftop gardens in Manhattan, right? All of these attempts to grow food locally, to sort of relocalize, replace, in a sense, right, reground agriculture and rural traditions in local communities in a sustainable fashion, to resist the industrialization, the globalization of food markets, right, and food production. All of these forms, according to Lyson, these represent a new wave in agriculture, and it's flying under the radar of the USDA, right? The statistics aren't there to measure the real impact and the size of these operations. In some cases, yeah, but in most cases, no. And so in Lyson's view, this is a real movement. Right? This is really taking hold, and it does, right now, it's not a serious challenge to the mega farms, to Tyson and Hormel and so on, right? But it has the potential to be something very different. And I think Bailey's work actually, I think Bailey kind of looms over this stuff. If you're getting your basket of fruits and vegetables in season through a CSA, you're participating in a UPIC operation or something like that, right? I mean, in a sense, you're doing the kinds of things that Bailey, I think, would have applauded. And as I think Bailey would have it, this new civic agriculture recognizes, again, the foundational role of the farmer in civic life and our relation to nature. Whether you want to call it sense of place or community identity, again, these themes rebound through civic agriculture, and I think that Bailey was there 100 years ago, pointing us in this direction. And so, in conclusion, why he matters? Well, I think he offers us a new foundation for thinking, not the only, but a new foundation for thinking about environmental ethics in a very pluralistic, civic-minded, anti-dualistic way. And I think his work really presents a challenge. It presents a challenge to environmental ethics and to environmental historians and to environmentalists today, because it points in these directions. I also think that his work provides a kind of philosophical mooring for civic agrarianism today. Wes Jackson's work, Wendell Berry's work, the institutional forms of civic agrarianism, agriculture that we've talked about, in an effort to link sustainable agriculture and food production in the local community. And finally, I think this is something that doesn't need to be lost, and actually discussing this with Christopher Preston today. Bailey's work reminds us that you can love wilderness and still be an agrarian, right? He did not think that you had to choose between a love of wild nature, wild critters, or the farm or the garden. I mean, he actually, maybe he was simple-minded, but he thought that we're dealing with a sort of a solicitous side of our personalities, and the caring side of our better angels, and that a love of nature, a love of the farm, a love of the garden, a love of the wild was all good, was all valid, was all appropriate, and it was a way to cultivate a kind of holistic, broad-sensed environmental ethic that could build this pride of place and a sense of community. And so I think as we look to these movements today, we ought to remember that if we're talking about agriculture, it doesn't mean we're not talking about wilderness, or it doesn't mean we're not talking about the cities. I mean, I think that's something that came out at the Peas Farm last night. We were talking more about a landscape level policy and planning approach to some of these issues. And I think, again, Bailey, I will put a plug for him. Bailey was there 100 years ago thinking very broadly about these things. And I think his is a voice that should sound much more familiar to us today than it does. Thank you.
We got about 15 minutes for questions.
All right. How Christian was Bailey?
Yeah.
You've effectively tied the link to civic virtue, virtuous behavior, almost a stewardship notion of gardening and of tilling the earth on behalf of some greater entity. How Christian was Bailey?
You probably got me on that, Bill. I mean, I tend to have a more secular reading of Bailey than the few others who have looked at Bailey's work. Obviously, a book like The Holy Earth is just dripping with spiritual and very religious sensibilities. I didn't have time to do it. I mean, there was enough packed in there as it is. But Bailey spent a lot of time talking about dominion. In a sense, is very relevant to what Lynn White said. And he said dominion does not carry ownership. It's a responsibility. And again, that's sort of the religious reading of stewardship. Is the counterpoint to the secular one that I've advanced. He was very Christian. I think the natural sort of objective value of the earth that Bailey recognized and understood was there because God put it there. And at the same time, it was almost as if he felt, as a scientist, he couldn't say that without then following it with a paragraph that said, that doesn't contradict evolution. Right? They both lead to the same path, the sort of unity of humans and nature. And I'm not sure, again, I think he tried to have it both ways. I mean, I think that is a tension in his thought, and it is part of his work, I think, that needs to be accommodated, and it's probably the more difficult. So I read Bailey. Am I committing Whiggish intellectual history? Probably. I mean, I read Bailey as more of a pragmatist and as a civic-minded agrarian than I do as a sort of spiritual biocentrist. But I think that just like with Leopold, I think there are multiple readings of Bailey, and you're right, that is a very strong one, which may be in tension with the reading that I offer here. Good question. Yeah.
Kind of counters or goes along with what
Yeah.
you were saying. I'm concerned about the indigenous worldview.
Yeah.
And I work with that, so that's important to me. And I don't see it touched at all, but I'm wondering, have you considered it? It seems the basis of environmental ethics, all indigenous worldwide, their philosophy, the indigenous people worldwide have something we need to learn from.
Yeah.
That's my take. I wondered if you could speak on that.
There certainly is, you're right to say that it wasn't mentioned. There certainly is would I call it a pocket? There are a number of environmental philosophers who have studied very closely Native American traditions, spiritual traditions, traditions of the land, Australian Aborigines. Baird Callicott, actually, one of the pioneers of the field, has written a whole book on the indigenous traditions of the world, basically. Now, I think the problem with that book is that then he sort of canvases all these religious, spiritual traditions, these indigenous traditions, and then he holds them up to the standard of Aldo Leopold's land ethic, right? So it's like they're good to the extent that they resemble the land ethic. So look at the Ojibwa. Don't they sound like Aldo Leopold? Wow, they're. So I mean, so that's that's one notable, I think, expression. I think the book is great in many respects, and that's one approach. There are a number of environmental historians and environmental philosophers who have unearthed, I think, the connections here. And not just, Eastern spiritual traditions. I think you look at a movement like deep ecology, which draws somewhat promiscuously from Eastern traditions, as well as process philosophy and other kinds of Western
There's a guy called Fajedi down in the University of New Mexico that's pretty important.
Yeah. I think, and if you look at the tradition too, you can dig back to Muir and Thoreau, who were very, I think, entranced by Native American views of the land. Thoreau used to love to find arrowheads and was, really thought that, in a sense, he was recreating some of that experience through his experience at Walden. And so I think it's woven into the tradition. I think it's probably true that in academic philosophy, there's a tendency not to privilege that tradition because it's seen as not formalized or somehow doing something else. I think in environmental ethics it has made inroads, but it's perhaps not as much as it should be. There's some very good people doing it, though. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I guess off of that, I was sort of thinking about it. It seems like we're working from an assumption that we have to rebuild, we have to destroy this dualism, and I feel like that's a relatively new creation, and that there is a model, and that we just need to look at the model. And in fact, it's existed in small pockets of rural, agrarian areas everywhere, all over the world. Europe, Africa, South America, North America. Right. Out of necessity, I feel like what we're doing is looking at, this build from the beginning of the dualism and taking that as history, where, we're doing ourselves a disservice and not looking at these older texts or these traditions in a very analytical way.
I think you're right, and in fact, I'll be honest here. One of the reviews, it was a very good review of my book, but one of the criticisms was that maybe that I talk about these dualisms as if they've always existed or that they've become hardened, and in fact that if I'm right about this alternative third way, then the dualisms never really existed. They're much more contemporary, and I give them too much play. I'm probably guilty of that because, coming out of environmental ethics, they've been beaten into my head. And I think it is true that not only in the intellectual tradition here, there is this sort of more pluralistic and integrated approach, but in the rural traditions that you're talking about. And you look at, there's a newer wave of environmental history since this first generation. People like Richard Judd at the University of Maine wrote a book, Common Lands, Common People. And he turned his attention to the people that we historically think were responsible for environmental disasters, the farmers of northern New England in the 1800s and so on. The ones that cut and ran or that cleared the forests and degraded the soil and so on and shot all the game, etc. And he actually returned to those communities and found a pretty interesting conservation ethic about farm beautification and kind of voluntaristic laws, self-regulation of hunting, ethical sort of prescriptions against certain, jacklighting and using, dogs and so on in hunting and all this. It was, pretty utilitarian in many ways. It's very anthropocentric, but it was also a pretty strong conservation ethic. And I think there's been a newer wave of historical scholarship, and this is part of kind of the social, the move of social history, right? To look at, the people that we forgot about the first time around in the academy. And that's a great example. Steve Stoll, a historian at Yale, has again looked at the agrarian tradition, looked at farmers in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and other places. Again, finding an ethic of permanence, of soil fertility, in places where we just thought they were all robber barons or they were, ignorant exploiters of the land. And so I think you're right. I think if we actually look at the way communities have lived on the planet, the decisions that have been made, the local institutions and so on, it is a different story. I think that the dualisms have come from, the academic tribe, basically. It's, serves an ideological purpose. If I'm going to be for something, I want to have someone who's against me, right, that I can raise money by denigrating, right? I can point my finger. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think that as this newer wave of environmental history comes along, which also includes urban history as environmental history, agrarian history as environmental history, and we see changes in environmental ethics slowly, I think we're going to come to a new understanding of some of these categories in some of our stories we tell. Yeah?
For those of us working within kind of community-based food systems, I'm wondering if you can tease out some of the, if there's any details or clues as to what Bailey might do if he were born in, say, 1960 and he were looking at our situation. What, even in general areas, what do you think he'd prioritize, or specific strategies that he would be? What would concern him most? And
I have two answers to that. On the one hand, the pragmatist in me wants to say, who the hell cares what Bailey would say? You know, I've done all this work, and I'm writing a book on Bailey, so I like Bailey, right? You got that part. And so I'm vested in it, but at the same time, his value isn't just that he was Bailey and he said these things, it's that they actually resonate with us today. And they resonate with a tradition in an interesting way that we hadn't seen. So that having said, if Bailey were alive today and looking at the landscape, he's partly implicated in the problem. I mean, again, I've presented one reading here of Bailey. He was also a big booster. I mean, he was a progressive. He was a scientist. He believed in the diffusion of technology across the countryside. Yeah, adaptation, right? But he was also very much a kind of progressive figure. And I think it would be uncharitable to say that Bailey's responsible for CAFOs, large hog farms or something like that. He's not. But his extension work, his interest in the science spirit across the countryside, that's the same boosterism that led to the incredible mechanization and industrialization of agriculture, the engineering shaping of agriculture in the 20th century. So if Bailey were alive today and looking, let's say he wasn't a party to some of that, and looking back, I'd have to think that with his civic mindedness, his emphasis on adapting agriculture to local conditions, his love of nature, his concern for nature study, his leadership in community organizing, his emphasis on the school garden and so on, I'd have to think that he would be a very powerful voice, maybe like a Wendell Berry, probably more practical. He'd be at a university probably, and he'd be shaping some of this. And I think he'd be very disturbed by the mega farms and by some of the environmental and social consequences of that style of agriculture. Would he be a big fan of biotechnology, agriculture biotechnology? Maybe, and that's why his legacy is a mixed one. There are warts there in his work, but there is also great deep insight and almost a prophetic character, I think, to some of his writing. But yeah, it's the same thing when you think of Aldo Leopold alive. I mean, what would Aldo Leopold be saying about, the Healthy Forest Initiative or something like that, I think I know what he'd say, but who knows? Yeah.
What's your opinion on Pete Singer's thoughts on animal rights?
Where'd that come from? That's actually, you could almost be a plant in the story here, because I do have a slide about that. That's very good. I've thought a bit about this because there's a deep history here, but one of the other dogmas of environmental ethics is that animal welfare and animal rights approaches don't belong in the discussion, right? And so this again is changing slowly. There's some environmental philosophers who've tried to bring animals back into the fold, but philosophically the idea and practically is that if you're concerned about the well-being of animals, that's not always an ecological position. Sometimes you might have to thin the deer herd, right, to save the forest, that kind of thing. Okay. Well, Singer's work, of course, is animal welfare as a utilitarian and so on. And he's written about all sorts of things. But I think we can actually see here, I think Bailey has a voice in this discussion in the application here to confined animal feeding organizations, or concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, big hog farms, chicken farms, and so on, where there are multiple reasons why we should be concerned about these, right? I mean, from an animal welfare perspective, it's ugly. And Singer really, almost in journalistically exposed in the 70s how ugly it could be, in addition to animal testing and other kinds of practices. Environmentally, right? You have these large, waste lagoons here. This is in North Carolina, Dane, your old neck of the woods. Where the hog waste and so on is impounded, and they fail, they pollute waterways, fish kills, and so on. Human health, ammonia being a byproduct of this, has caused respiratory problems and all sorts of problems in farm workers. Civic health, well, we're dealing with large farms that pull money out of the community and perhaps threaten small farms. So there are multiple reasons why we should care, right? The animal welfare one is a very powerful one, but when you look at environmental ethics, we often like to segment, again, like the ethical universe, and so environmental ethicists, we care about the wilderness, we care about species and so on. We don't care as much about domestic animals and farms. We'll let the animal folks care about that. Well, I think Bailey, again, because he was pluralistic in his ethical system, because he looked at the larger picture, he actually also wrote about animal welfare. He was very concerned about hunting. He was very concerned. He thought that a good farmer held a moral regard for his livestock or her livestock, as well as, right, the soil, the farm, the family, right? And again, I think that's kind of a remarkable sentiment. Now, humane societies and so on in England and other places were active during this time period, but Bailey, as a scientist, a university administrator, was going a little bit out on a limb, but he tied his understanding of a good farmer to partly, a small part, animal welfare considerations. And so I think his framework offers us a way to look at current practices that also involve an animal welfare consideration that, not necessarily would end up in the same place as Singer, right? But then Singer wouldn't end up the same place as Tom Regan, who believes in rights of animals, right? Who would be more liberationist, actually, or abolitionist, I guess. So yeah, that's a great question. And that makes him also, I think, a very contemporary figure, and that he was writing about all of these things. So was John Muir, though, actually. Yeah, Christopher.
So personal observation, which I promise I mean tongue-in-cheek.
Okay.
In some respects, where you end up is wanting to make American environmentalism more like English environmentalism.
Only an Englishman would come up with that one, Christopher.
It's not too dissimilar a point to the one I made up there in the corner. There are other sort of examples here, and but why is, with your historian hat on,
Okay.
why is this happening now?
And why didn't it happen 20 years ago, or it's...
And why did it not take off 100 years ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can tell you why I think Bailey is persona non grata in environmental ethics, because of these dogmas and because of the way the field's developed. I can't tell you as much why he wasn't taken up by the conservation movement, by the policy apparatus of his time, why the NGOs, why he is not an emblematic figure in reform in the countryside, in the treatment of animals, agriculture, and so on. I don't know why. I suspect a few things. He wasn't the greatest stylist, in prose. He wasn't I think John Muir's prose is horrible, but Bailey's is close. He wasn't an Aldo Leopold, in other words. It could be his religious sensibilities, right? Didn't resonate with the right audiences at the right time. He certainly was politically situated. I guess, you could say it's the radical nature of some of his proposals. Is it because he was so scattershot ethically? Humanist, non-anthropocentrist, talked about animals, then went off and studied palm trees. He was all over the place. Did that work against him? He didn't leave us a Sand County Almanac, a book that could be picked up, a tome like that. The Holy Earth falls short. I think it's a masterpiece, but why did it take us so long to recover these ideas? That's a great question. I think it's the dominance of a certain kind of environmentalism, of a wilderness environmentalism in the U.S. that really took hold for decades, and that only in the recent years, the last 10 years, has shown some signs of receding. And as it does, as the tide goes back, I think we're seeing Bailey and others who seem to have something to say about this new moment we're in. You could respond one of two ways. You could say, well, we didn't listen to them the first time around, so why bother with them now? Or you could say, maybe we should have listened to them. Maybe they do have something to say.
That's a good point, too.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
thank you
right.
again for coming.
Thank you.